Hi, everybody. Welcome to Microcosm Live. This week we are talking with Adonia Lugo, the author of BicycleRace. Adonia and I were just catching up about how, was it 15 years ago?
Something along those lines, yeah.
Yeah, 15 years ago, we were college classmates at Reed College here in Portland, and we have both we didn't really know each other very well then, but we have since kind of moved into similar sphere of interest and occupation with bicycle advocacy and activism and writing books. And I had the pleasure of being Adonia's editor with BicycleRace. This was such a good book. And I think often about like kind of our shared academic background, because I think we both had to like struggle to overcome it. That's a terrible way to put it. Academic writing is something to truly overcome. And really they teach you how to write yourself into these like tight little knots of theory that only other academics can unwind. And I think one of the things I'm most proud of with BicycleRace is like watching you take it from like parts of your PhD thesis about sort of bicycle culture and turn it into this like beautifully written book that anybody can pick up and understand and read and learn from. And a lot of people had. It's been an incredibly popular book. It's been actually, yeah, one of our best-selling books of all time in terms of just people individually coming to us and buying a copy. And then we hear a lot of great feedback about it as well. But I could talk all day about how great a book it is, but I think we would rather hear from you, Adonia. Can you kind of tell us about your book and what your goals were with writing it and what you've been doing since it came out also?
Sure, yeah. Well, yeah, there is no way that this book would have transpired without your mentorship and support, Ellie. So just putting that there as the baseline. I totally wanted to walk away from academic writing when I finished my PhD and started working in bicycle advocacy, where I was using my more kind of public oriented blog writing style, and really just didn't look at my dissertation for quite a while. I was happy to take space away from it. And then I got sort of, coached into taking on this project of doing a book about my experiences working in bicycle advocacy and helping to define bike equity and getting to draw on what I had done for my dissertation project. So it was a really neat opportunity with so much support along the way to take that monster, just really, citation heavy document that I had as a result of, years of working on my dissertation, and look inside of it for some stories that could resonate with people. And it was it was a lot more work than I expected. I really, this is just my attitude in general. Like there's a family story about being at a barbecue at some point when I was really little, I don't know, like 3 or 4. And there was a swimming pool, and I remember this. There was a little girl younger than me who got into the swimming pool and was swimming around. And I'm a little bit competitive. So I thought, if she can swim, I guess I must be able to swim. She's younger than me. And I, just went into the pool, and fortunately there were a lot of adults there, and I was rescued and didn't drown. But I tend to kind of look at things and go, yeah, I guess I could probably do that. If people are telling me they think I can do it, and that's what you did with the book. And if I had known how much work it was actually going to be, I probably would have just said, no, I don't think I can accomplish that. I thought I could get it done in like 3 months. And then I think the actual editing process, the writing and editing process, took more like 2.5 years. And I think that's actually short, right? In the very long time scale of publishing. So I have to say, since we got the book out, and I've been able to go around the country and even to some different countries beyond the U.S. and talk about the book, I have not been super motivated to dig into another writing project. But more recently, I have been picking up on some research going in a somewhat different direction. There actually is a lot of urban history in BicycleRace, because I'm someone who really enjoys digging into the sense and atmosphere of what our city spaces were like at different points in the past. So there is some of that in this book, but the next project I'm working on is really focused more specifically on the feeling of LA's built environment at some different points in like 1889, 1895, 1906, and 1912, and all around the history of a really unusual lady who happened to be my great-grandfather's sister, a Norwegian immigrant who came to LA in the 1880s and just did some really unusual things, like hosted meditations and vegetarian uh, communes, and got lambasted in the LA Times for being the incorrect kind of woman. So yeah, so I'm starting to dig into that project and enjoying it, but it has been nice taking a break from something as heavy as the material in BicycleRace.
Awesome. I am excited to read about that project. That sounds like an amazing ancestor and role model to learn about and have in your life. Back to BicycleRace, when you, just for people watching who haven't read the book, how would you like quickly summarize it if you were meeting someone at a party, say, and they were like, tell me about your book, and you could tell they really meant it?
Yeah, did they really mean it? It's yeah, I'm still getting used to the whole like I'm someone who wrote a book kind of, mode. But yeah, usually I tell people that it's a memoir about my experiences being a woman of color, studying the intersections of race and class and transportation, and then getting involved myself with trying to expand the field of bicycle advocacy to encompass more kinds of people and their concerns about safety, and learning that the field of bicycle advocacy, like many environmental social movements, is reflective of the legacy of segregation that still holds us back in this country, where you have people who are dreaming separately and not really together. And so we have this funny landscape, I mean, funny, not funny, haha, but like landscape of urban movements where you can be talking about the streets and referring to people who live on the streets and the life of the streets and the hardship of neighborhoods where street spaces are not safe, and it's because of gang violence or because of over policing, or these different things that prey upon our vulnerable communities and our racialized communities. Or you could be talking about the streets and mean parklets and bulb outs and the MUTCD, and how do we get it to incorporate cycle tracks and bicycle signals. And so there's such a gap there in terms of how we're conceiving of what is wrong with our cities. And I think that there is a lot happening in the world right now that both highlights that that gap is still there, and I think points in ways that we can work toward resolving it. But yeah, the bike movement is reflective of its time and place, and the U.S. bike movement that gained steam in the 70s and then really exploded in the 90s, and that I joined in about 2008, is still in many ways has yet to grapple with the legacy of racial segregation, as part of the vision it has for the future of our streets and cities. So that's what the book's about.
Yes, I mean, while you were talking, I was listening and I was remembering reading your book for the first time in its early drafts, and also reading your blog, which, are you still blogging at urbanadonia.com?
No, it's there, but I'm not adding to it.
Well, I highly recommend the excellent back catalog of blog posts at urbanadonia.com. But yeah, reading that and talking to you and hearing you speak and reading your reports while you worked for a bike advocacy organization also all really helped me understand something that I hadn't really absorbed before. And it really was about this sort of like we're dreaming apart what my view of the street is and what my view of what it means to be free and to move around the streets in safety is very different than what somebody else's might be. And I was thinking about that a lot this weekend while reading the news and watching people's Instagram stories from Minneapolis, and yeah, just processing a lot of things that have been kind of happening for a very long time as an unfortunate norm, but have really only kind of entered my consciousness around the same time I was getting to know you, which also happened to be in like 2014 with Ferguson, and somebody being literally killed for walking down the street. Somebody didn't like it, and I was yes. Now I have to look at my notes because I'm getting emotional. But I guess my question is, given sort of the incidents that happened this weekend with Christian Cooper and with George Floyd being murdered, and a few months ago, Ahmaud Arbery, who was killed for going for a run, and someone thought he looked suspicious. What would transportation advocacy and environmental justice movements look like if they took that as if they even took the potential for incidents like those into account? Because it seems like bike advocacy really doesn't, like white bike advocates are not thinking about that as being even something that could possibly happen, at least not to them or anyone they know. And yeah, like what would an alternate version look like, or what's your take on this generally?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, in the years since I was doing the work that I talk about in BicycleRace, I've gotten to help be part of a group called the Untokening that really specifically focuses on working with the concept of mobility justice, and what does it mean for us to try and look at all of the ways that people are safe or not safe when they're traveling out and about in cities, and what would we need to do in order to actually account for the different vulnerabilities that people in their different bodies have, because it was, for me, the work of the movement for Black Lives is so key in giving me the perspective that we can't talk about street safety as though it only involves vehicular violence. And I know that's something that is still, not necessarily a welcome message or even a message that makes sense to a lot of people who work in sustainable transportation fields, including bike advocacy, or even in the field of transportation research. There's a really, really strong understanding of safety referring to not getting hit by a car. And there's a lot of, unfortunately, like as big as that unsafety is, and as tragic and awful and accepted as the violence that comes with over reliance on cars is, there's actually a lot of other ways that people can be unsafe in streets as well. And so these cases where, sometimes there's a really clear connection, like with Ahmaud Arbery, who was going for a run and doing the thing that so much public health money has been poured into in the last decade around trying to encourage, healthy physical activity. And the reality is, depending on what body you're in, your safety in just trying to keep yourself fit and healthy for your family and for your life can put you at risk. And then even, in cases like the horrible, horrible tragedy of George Floyd, he wasn't engaged in a like quote unquote active transportation activity at the time of his apprehension by the police, but the violence of, the dehumanization of every element, and then just the final, fucked up mess of this man appearing to lose life on the camera of a bystander. I mean, to have somebody's humanity turned into something that can be crushed in a public roadway, I mean, how can we not be making a connection between that kind of violence and street safety? But historically that connection hasn't been made. There really is a difference when we're talking about street safety in a transportation paradigm versus street safety in the way that anti-violence movements and folks who are trying to dismantle the prison industrial complex and work toward abolition, and folks who are in support of people who are experiencing homelessness, transgender rights groups. Like, there's a universe of people out there who are talking about street safety in this much more holistic way that has to do with actually getting to hold each other in community. And I think that there is so much opportunity for people who work in transportation, who are using terms like street safety to make the connection with public safety, and also make the next step of saying, I am not in support of public safety models that continue to take life away from some of our communities in the name of the safety of others. It does not, there is, yeah, the inequality of what's been happening with COVID-19 and the way that some families are losing their loved ones and are facing, on top of that, the kind of economic, a ratcheting up of economic insecurity that is something they've already been living with, versus, in my homeland of Orange County, you've got people who are protesting because somebody asked them to wear a mask, or God forbid, not go to the beach. Just the contrasts that we're living through right now are, I think, really, really tough for those of us who, have been aware of those contrasts. And I just hope that it can help to connect some of the dots that maybe have not been as clear to people who, are already activated and engaged around making change in the places where they live, but aren't necessarily seeing that we're all in this together. And it really can't just be a matter of, I'm going to focus on this one little micro piece of what happens in my daily life. The more that we can actually be thinking about building safety as something that holds all of us inside of it, and not having some people on the outside, I think the stronger, our work will be, and the more that we'll actually get to feel like being bike activists or being, sustainable transportation activists ties us in with this bigger change that we need our world to go through.
Man, there's so much to unpack here. Let's talk a little bit more about safety, because I think that is often a sticking point for bike advocates, who often we want to be like, yay, bikes are the best, cars are really unsafe. And then it's easy to forget that, like, in some specific places or in some situations, or for some people, cars are safer. For instance, like, if you have a kind of disability that makes it impossible for you to drive a car, maybe cars are not the safest, but maybe you have one that makes it impossible for you to ride a bike or keep your balance while walking, and a car is the safest. Or, thinking about like somebody who does not necessarily feel safe being on the streets, or being on the streets in a certain places at a certain time, a car can be a safety net. And, sometimes that's the result of that person's prejudice, and sometimes that's the result of real threats to that person's life. But like, just this idea of safety, I think, is a real sticking point often for bicycle activists and advocates, because we want to see only that bikes are safe, or that like bikes are only unsafe because of cars, as you're saying, only the vehicular threat is real. And then it's hard for us to sort of like, I guess, even acknowledge the reality of somebody who's like, no, car, I got to have a car. Like that, otherwise I would die without one. And yeah, like that, I think, is a barrier, I think, for understanding often. And like, how do you address that in your talking to people and in your work?
Well, it depends on, if I'm speaking to an audience that is primarily white, really bike identified people, I tend to lead with the fact, like the compassion that I feel for that position, because I'm definitely someone who has identified as car free in the past and felt, had years of feeling very strongly about even accepting rides, and I really just part of what motivated me to both you know, bring my focus as an anthropology graduate student to transportation and street spaces, and then also be an activist around it, is because I feel in my body the fear and the threat of violence. When I'm out there riding a bike and the people I'm interacting with are not thinking about, my safety or each other's safety. And so I mean, I understand from that level. And then I also know from years of, collaborating with people in bike and street safety conversations that people, it's not just a matter of, oh, they know the fear, they've been hit. They have been hurt. They have loved ones who've died. It's so real, that focus on vehicular violence is not in any way like a trivial, um, whoa, hang up. Like, why do they always want to talk about that? It's like, no, 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 no. You're absolutely right that this is a massive, massive problem. So usually if I'm talking to an audience where I get a sense that, like me, that was their motivator to get involved in advocacy, I really want to own that nobody would, I mean, I don't want to diminish the importance of looking at the problem of vehicular violence. However, there are other things, right? So that's how I lead in those conversations. If I'm in conversation with somebody who doesn't have that like really deep identity around, the visceral vulnerability of being a bicycle user, then I guess usually I try not to say things that are going to be just outright judgmental about how they might relate to transportation, differently than I do. And I think that, like, I don't know, I'm getting to be in this really interesting conversation right now with some friends in LA around what narratives we see missing in how our region talks about transportation, both in the media and, in the public sphere, and how we are still in many ways kind of stuck in this dichotomy of, the very poor who must use transit and the advocacy on their behalf, and the, people who maybe are not leading with their economic struggle, who would like to be able to just ride a bicycle, darn it. And there's actually a lot more culture in between those two positions, and it's, I feel like, largely invisible, even though LA is a very multiracial and has many, many justice movements and people who are engaged in those, who like actively bring their critique of white supremacy and privilege into how they're moving through the region. We don't really have a narrative. And in one of our discussions, a good friend of mine, Monique Lopez, who's the founder of Pueblo Planning, brought up that it's not car culture that we're trying to combat, because there's actually a lot of really positive things about the way that people relate to cars in this region, and like beautiful aesthetic clubs, and ways that people are having this kind of techno-social relationship with this piece of technology. And then there's all the stuff about like, oh, the car gets you to grandma's house, or all the family stuff that's tied up in it. And the stuff about, hey, your family made it here from the violence of some other place, and you are just trying to feel safe and have a good life. Far be it from me to say that like you're automatically a bad person because a car is part of that. So there's all these things that make some of us wary about wanting to say car culture is the problem. Car culture is the problem. And so what Monique brought up is, it's really what she's heard in talking to people who are participants in Pueblo's workshops, with street vendors and groups like that, is the culture of privilege on our roadways is the issue. This, this mentality that traveling faster, or that you need to be able to go first, or that, there's like in so many ways, this like medieval kind of glove slap, you've stepped on my honor thing that happens in our roadways. And it's really destructive. And it is not something that is only, tied to race or class privilege. Because unfortunately, lots and lots of people who don't have race and class privilege will also act in a way that, is about having that privilege on our roadways. But just shifting to be able to identify like what the real problem is in terms of treating each other shitty. And the car, hey, actually, it makes it real easy to treat each other shitty, whether you want to or not. Like putting yourself behind that much stuff in order to interact with other humans. Like, yeah, you might be a dick and not even mean to be a dick. So yeah, it does tend to happen a lot with cars, but it's not like somehow, we've developed a really fantastic analysis in the sustainable transportation world and can explain to people like, here's what we want to leave behind with a future culture and here's what we want to continue. Usually the emphasis has been on the technological pieces. So saying, okay, the car is bad, full stop, or the gasoline car is bad, full stop, instead of getting into these deeper questions of how people relate to these pieces of technology and how we can use them to, further our shitty hierarchies or choose not to use them in that way.
Or the technology of, say, the infrastructure, the transportation infrastructure, which is something that you write a lot about in BicycleRace. You coined a really great term, human infrastructure, that I just love, and I feel like it's kind of a wonderful missing piece of the puzzle. Can you explain what human infrastructure means and why you talk about it?
Mm-hmm. I think I didn't coin the term human
Oh, you didn't?
infrastructure.
Okay.
No, when I was doing my anthropology PhD, there was a kind of flowering of work coming out around experimental approaches to infrastructure within anthropology. And so there were a few authors out there who were starting to talk about social infrastructure, human infrastructure, and it was in particular two ethnographers who've written about Kinshasa that I picked up on the term from. So that's Abdou-Malik Simone and Philip de Boeck, who just both have fantastic writing that looks at what is it that people do for each other and the roles that we play for each other when our infrastructure systems around us are not working or aren't working the way we need them to. Well, we actually step in and get things done for each other. We're not just waiting for the systems to work in the way we need them to. So the way that I have used human infrastructure in my work, it was in part because, I was like reading this stuff about social and human infrastructure in my anthro classes, and then talking to people about bicycling, and they're the ones who are talking about infrastructure all the time. And so it kind of clicked that maybe bringing up the cultural stuff and the attitudes and all the human elements could make sense in those conversations if I referred to it as a form of infrastructure, because that's people are really fixated on the built environment and those built systems. And so then it's kind of what led me to start experimenting with writing about the concept. And I do think it is helpful to use in a few different registers. Like one is literally in terms of when you're out there on the road, there's a human infrastructure that you're interfacing with, like regardless of the design of the street where you're traveling, because how this person over here chooses to behave on that day is going to be different, and who you're encountering. And sometimes when I ride the bus, it's like wonderful and meditative. And sometimes when I ride the bus, I'm really angry because there's somebody who, hasn't been taking their meds and they're making the public space into a nightmare for everybody. Or sometimes when I'm, taking a walk, it's great and I can just be like nodding hello to neighbors. And sometimes, there's like a whole bunch of random people who are doing something, and you can't plan as much as our modeling technologies in the transportation field try to, you can't plan for what a street space is actually going to feel like at a given time, because people do bring their creative element to it. So that's one aspect of human infrastructure. And then another aspect really just has to do with like social networks and relationships. And that ties back in with the built environment, because the street spaces we have are the product of what people in the past thought was a good idea, and who in the past had the influence and power to decide, what was a good idea for public spending. So one example of that would be, our highway system. And we know that there was a tremendous amount of top-down planning that went into creating our interstate highways, and so many urban neighborhoods got chewed up, so many families got thrown out and displaced, housing wasn't built in its place, all that kind of stuff. So you could look at that sort of a system that we live with now and say, this infrastructure is bad and we need to redesign it, which I think is true. But you can also look at it and say, dang, that top-down planning model that actually still is really normal is not good, and leads to outcomes that place the burden of environmental pollution and mobility on certain people's shoulders. So looking at just who are we talking to, who are we in dialogue with, who do we think of when certain kinds of problem comes to our mind, or when somebody brings something up. And so this more like social network meaning of human infrastructure is something that I've gotten to work with a lot in the last decade, because I've had the opportunity to co-create different kinds of like email lists and spaces virtually and in person to bring together different kind of cross sections of people that I'm in dialogue with about transportation or research or social justice and racial justice. And so I think that there is a lot of power in thinking about how the relationships we have or don't have play a role in shaping our street spaces and what they feel like.
There's so much there. We have one request. Can you repeat the names of the scholars that coined the term human infrastructure, and then maybe also email them to us so that we can post it on the YouTube video?
Sure, yeah. It's Abdou Malik Simone, and I think you spell his name Abdoumaliq, and then Simone is Simone. And then Philip Deboick. Philip is Filip, and then Deboick is Deboeck.
That was impressive, an impressive feat of spelling. And we will put that in the notes under the YouTube video after we're done, and maybe even a link to their research if such a thing can be had by lay people. We have a ton of questions here, so I'm going to take some audience questions. One of them is human infrastructure akin to social networking? And I think you did answer that. I guess it sounds like there's two things. There's like social networking, but then there's also like I was thinking about during COVID, people in some cities, they're shutting down streets for people to walk, but in most places, people are also just walking in the street. And would that count as human infrastructure?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and really the project that I was working on that really highlighted to me this human infrastructure element was an open streets project in LA, creating Ciclovia here, which I helped to get that started from 2008 to 2010. And absolutely, it was kind of like, why do some of us feel like we have permission to ride our bikes or walk in these urban neighborhoods and others don't? And there's something that has to do with us, not the streetscape. I mean, the streetscape is obviously a factor, right? But out of economic necessity or an activisty impetus, a lot of people have always gotten around LA on foot and on bikes. And to think that we wouldn't do that until it was like deemed okay or welcomed by the city just didn't match what I was seeing in terms of people just going ahead and taking space and having more of a direct action approach. So yeah, I think that that is a really key part of what made me think about human infrastructure at all, is that, we can just reclaim space. But whether you feel like you have the permission to do that, and how our public safety infrastructures respond when you go out and make those claims is not the same for different people, depending on the body you're traveling in.
Another question from Pavlos. Can you expand the idea of safety and mobility and access in terms of public spaces in general, rather than just streets, as it regards to race and other marginalized communities?
I think that's kind of beyond what I feel like I can talk about confidently. I am in no way, I think, tied in with the broader discussions around reclaiming public space and, like the Occupy movement approach to things. So I wouldn't want to speak, out of turn about kind of what it is people think they're doing with that kind of thing. But I do think there is really good potential for anyone who's concerned about street safety and coming more from the transportation understanding of it, getting familiar with the concept of the right to the city, and the history of the enclosure of the commons, and then how people now are talking about like new commons or recommoning and that sort of thing. Because there is, I mean, if you're not familiar with it, there is a whole lot of stuff out there about what is public space, who has access to it, who doesn't, and the street safety stuff in some ways overlaps. But I think the kind of like I was saying earlier, learning from the movement for Black Lives, and what for me, came together around being a safe streets advocate with the racial discrimination piece, was just more specifically, we have this whole field of engineers and researchers and planners and public officials whose job is to keep our streets maintained, build streets, design streets, maintain streets, keep them safe. And that huge infrastructure of people was not looking at policing as a problem. Or if they were, it was more that there wasn't enough policing, because if we would just enforce our traffic laws, then our streets would be safe, which we know is not the right direction. But anyway, I think, yeah, there's a lot more that could be explored around how trying to bring more awareness about the racialized policing of public spaces fits in with street safety. And I feel like I'm someone who's just been scratching the surface.
Thank you. I'm taking these questions a little bit out of order, but I will get to all your questions, so hang on. This one I'm taking now because it seems related, and also because I feel a little gleeful about how you'll answer it. But Kyle Johnson asks, what do you think US advocates should take from the story of bikes in the Netherlands, and what should we be wary of? Have fun.
Yeah, so something that I and other people have noticed over the years is that there has seemed to be a privileging of European cities when it comes to models that US cities want to be aspiring to around things like being bike friendly. And what I would say about that is, one, just it's a good idea to question, well, yeah, if it is only European cities we're looking at, why is that? And how do we actually have a broader international dialogue on these things, given the huge economic power dynamics that come into play when you're trying to make a comparison between, Amsterdam and, let's say, a formerly colonized region, where the Dutch have had some influence, like Indonesia? Or how would you have that conversation comparing, street spaces in a more southern part of Europe, like Madrid, with what's happening in Bogota or other Latin American cities? I think there are so many more ways we can do international comparison. Like, I'm a huge Star Trek fan, so I think it would be even cooler if we were in dialogue with like the Vulcans and the Klingons and the Romulans about what they were doing with their cityscapes. But even here on Earth, there's a shit ton of diversity in terms of, how people are figuring things out. And I think there's just a lot more models to look at. So that's just baseline. There's more to look at. We should question the colonial mindset that we have all been developed within, that tells us European models are better than models from other parts of the world. And that is so real. And if you're not familiar with, trying to look at decolonizing, it's really something to get familiar with so that you can see where your own actions are totally part of this colonial history that's still playing out. So there's all those reasons to be a little skeptical, I think, about just drawing on European models. But the biggest one that has stood out to me is we're talking about socialist countries, right? That there's like, how would you compare social services in the Netherlands to social services in the US? How would you compare, racial diversity in the Netherlands to racial diversity in the US? How would you compare population size in the Netherlands to population size in the US? Like, there are all these other factors that have to do with potentially shaping how people might be willing to behave towards strangers in roadways that I don't think have to do with design. I really think if we did more to create economic equality within our society, we probably wouldn't be such dicks to each other on the road, right? And I think that in Northern European countries where they have made that kind of investment in a social safety net, maybe that's part of why, people seem to be more polite or more okay with somebody on a bicycle kind of riding without knowing exactly what they're doing. Because that's a lot of what I saw when I was in the Netherlands is, people in Amsterdam are riding rusty old hunks on flat tires, and it's just, that's fine, because it doesn't seem to really piss anyone off that much. And I really, it's clear to me from my participation in US bicycle advocacy that the theory of why that is, people really think it's tied to the infrastructure, but I think there might be some other factors at play. And hey, if y'all are calling for more of a socialist approach to government spending in the US so that we can get to bike lanes or, bike infrastructure like they have in the Netherlands, I'm all for it. But I really don't think that the infrastructure on its own has the power to create that.
This does beg the question, and Rebecca Small has brought it up here, of what would Klingons, Vulcans, and Romulans do about bicycle culture and infrastructure? Can you give us an analysis of what we can learn from them, positive or negative?
Well, I think there would be a lot of violence. I actually don't think the Romulans or the Klingons would be a good example to look at, or the Vulcans for that matter, because they are pretty snobby. As much as they like to think they're above emotions, they can be very distant and above it all in a not so friendly way. So yeah, I wouldn't say that I've really seen on Star Trek the perfect equal place. Really, maybe Risa, the pleasure planet. If we looked to them for examples on how to interact in positive ways in streets, we might have a very good time.
Eric Anderson has a book idea for you: Vulcan Street Design for the Needs of the Many. So you've got that one for free. You can run with that. I know there's a market for it, I can tell you.
Well, maybe the next Star Trek series should be about, urban planning.
It's not a bad idea. If any film runners are listening to this, to please pay Adonia a lot of money to consult with you about that. Detroit Greenways Coalition has a question. Any thoughts on how we make the bike industry, like manufacturers, shops, and the lobbyists, diverse and inclusive?
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't have a lot of insight into how the bike industry is being pressured at this point in time. I think that it was, I'm glad that I worked on bicycle advocacy at the national level for a while, because it helped me to understand how advocacy and industry relate to each other and not just around bicycling, but the transportation industry more broadly. And so this is probably the case for any industry. I just haven't worked in other ones besides higher education. But what I saw happening was our job as advocates was to be putting pressure on elected officials to create more business opportunities for the bike industry. And the bike industry includes, planning firms and places that get contracts from local governments or municipal governments to do planning and design and stuff like that. That's really what we were asking for. Like the time that I was at the League of American Bicyclists, they had a very strong focus on getting more federal money allocated toward bicycle infrastructure projects. And the theory of change there is if you build it, they will come. If you build more of that infrastructure, then people will become bicycle riders. But in the short term and in the economic sense, if you look at that, if you're lobbying for more spending on infrastructure, what that means is more contracts for companies that will design and build infrastructure for you. It's not really about getting to the end users of those roadways or the people who are actually living in these neighborhoods and are more familiar with the nuance and complexity of what's happening in their streets. So my main takeaway when I stopped working in bicycle advocacy was not really that interested in supporting or making my main thrust as a thinker, putting my weight behind a particular industry. I think that there's a lot of work we have to do overall in this country to be redesigning our economy and our expectations of success when it comes to business and how our industries are structured. And when we get to a place where all of the design firms are worker-owned cooperatives that have like fantastic representation from the neighborhoods where they're doing their design work, that'll be awesome, and I will be so in support of that industry. But the current structure we have is one that I really never became an insider around. I think the actual like bike building industry seems troubled around diversity issues. I mean, that's kind of the impression I got from people I know who are more plugged into it. But when there's a lack of interest around, recognizing that you're missing out on a massive amount of business opportunities, it's kind of hard for, particular individuals to get in there and really like, hey, there's a problem. It's like they're fine with having their sales be as low as they are. So what is, if they don't want the help, how are you supposed to, give it to them? So anyway, I personally am not someone who's trying to influence, the bike industry, but more power to you if you are. And hey, I would think that they'd want to have a massive increase in their sales, right? But
you'd think capitalism doesn't always work the way it's cracked up to. So let's talk a little bit more about you and Bicycle. So BicycleRace came out 2 years ago, and you were probably done writing it about a year before that. Can you talk about like what's changed since then? I'm sure you've had people come up to you and be like, I have stopped doing this and started doing this because of your book, and maybe sometimes that's good and sometimes you cringe. But have you like witnessed the book having an impact on anything that you're like especially proud of? And also, I'd also like to know like what's changed in your thinking since then. I know it's so hard to like send a book to print, and then by the time it comes out, you're like, I'm on a different track now. But yeah, what track are you on?
Yeah, what for me has been the most like affirming feedback that tells me doing the book was worth it is really just hearing people say that they read something that reflected their own experience that they hadn't seen written down before. And that for me is like really, I have come to understand that's something that I can contribute to the processes that I'm part of. And it's really rooted in my understanding of what it is to be an anthropologist. Because, anthropologists back in the day, back in the dark times of the worst kind of colonial mentality within anthropology, there was a belief that anthropologists could observe a situation, be a fly on the wall, and not impact it. You know, like you were this outsider, usually from Europe, who was like going in and recording the practices of the natives, but you didn't really have anything to do with it. And we know that that is so not true. And the people who were doing that kind of ethnographic practice were humans, and the people who they were interacting with had ideas about what the hell that human was doing there, and that human was often getting paid by a colonial government that was going to use that human's findings to make it easier to control that population. So that's like the history of anthropology. And so for the last like 35 or 40 years, anthropologists have been trying to figure out, like, okay, what can we do that's not that, but that is really pro the beautiful diversity of human culture, and takes under analysis what the hell is going on with how we inhabit these physical spaces, but relate to them totally differently, and can be in the same places but understand them through these totally different cultural lenses. So the stuff that really influenced me, as I was like developing into a Dr. Lugo PhD anthropologist, had to do with the fact that sometimes when you're the person who just has the privilege and time to hang around and listen and kind of hear what people are talking about, you can then report back to the group some of the things that you're hearing that maybe they hadn't noticed. And you can help actually like name new phenomena in the world, or just acknowledge realities that have been there forever but just didn't have a language or a name or a word to describe them. And so that's like, that for me is like the point of what I'm trying to do when I'm speaking and writing and engaging with people. And so that's like for me super affirming when people say like there's something that they read that reflects their experience. And in terms of what's changed in my perspective, I am still learning. I've been working for about 3 years now on this, but still have a lot to learn around actually bringing Indigenous justice into the understanding I have of mobility in space. And in my book, I talk a little bit about the colonial history of the region where I'm from because it shaped me. But I didn't do that sort of analysis in partnership with anybody from the local tribes. So where I'm from in San Juan Capistrano is the ancestral homeland of the Ahashiman people, and where I live now in LA is the ancestral homeland of the Tongva people. And those are both tribes that don't have federal recognition, like don't legally exist as people, even though they've been here for 10,000 years. So I'm still working on learning how to move in good relationship with people who are like part of that living culture. And there's a group here in LA called the Sacred Places Institute for Indigenous Peoples that has been a really good collaborator for me in that process. So yeah, Indigenous justice, how do we make that part of the conversation? And as I said earlier, I get to think a lot with people now about mobility justice. And something that's really key there is, and I think Mimi Scheller is the person who, got me thinking about this the most. When we talk about mobility justice, it's not just about the freedom to move safely, it's also about the freedom to not have to fucking move because you are being displaced by violence or gentrification or these forces. So how do we have a joint conversation that's not only about how we're traveling safely, but that's also about the people who are being forced to be part of global migrations that are not ending anytime soon. And, the forecasts all say that climate change is just going to exacerbate these kinds of problems. What can we do to understand the connections between the kind of shittiness that we experience in our streets and the kind of shittiness that we are propagating on a more international level? So looking at how we give people the space and freedom to hold still is part of mobility justice. And I think that's really important right now, considering, so many people who have the privilege to stay at home are fighting against that versus all the people who don't have that privilege. What are we doing to actually make it safe for them to stay at home? So those are some ways that my thinking has changed a little bit since BicycleRace.
And of course, everybody's thinking has changed considerably in the last 2 months, whether we planned for that or not. And I appreciate you bringing it back to that. We are starting to run out of time. I'm going to talk for 1 minute about your book and then about our next book event, and then I'm going to ask you a couple closing questions, okay? So we're talking with Adonia Lugo, whose book, Bicycle/Race, Transportation, Culture, and Resistance. So good, so worth reading if you haven't read it yet. And we're doing this live event in partnership with Eso Won Bookstore, which is a Black-owned bookstore in Los Angeles. And if you go to their website and search Bicycle/Race, you can buy Adonia's book directly from them and support an amazing local independent business, as well as getting a really good book to read. You might find some other stuff. They have a lot of recommendations that I was personally eyeballing. So we are doing another live event on June 5th, Friday, June 5th at 2 p.m. Pacific time with Alexander Herbert, who is the author of What About Tomorrow? It's an oral history of punk in Russia, from the Soviet Union to Pussy Riot. Super fascinating. And Alexander's another recovering academic, though I think he might not be recovering. I think he's actually just in academia, but being an oral history, his book is incredibly readable. And so join us Friday, June 5th at 2 p.m. to talk about that. So Adonia, a couple of final questions for you. How are you personally coping with the pandemic?
A lot of gardening. I made a sourdough starter and freaking doing a lot of online archival research about LA in 1895.
It's the perfect time for all of that.
Works for me.
Have you been like going out and going on a bike ride or going on a walk, or just staying put?
I haven't. I don't feel safe right now. I mean, I don't feel safe. I feel safe at home, and I feel like I'm really lucky to have fucking dirt to dig in and a kitchen to mess around with. And yeah, I have not been feeling the urge to get out and ride my bike. I ride a stationary bike at home a lot.
Stationary bikes, I feel like, is the thing bike advocates don't talk about, but bike racers talk a lot about. We have something to learn from them. And do you have any final words of wisdom? I want to thank everybody who's tuning in and watching this. I see we're still getting more questions, but come up with your own answers and come right to us about them. But yeah, what are your parting thoughts, especially to people who like feel motivated by what you've just said to like get out there and do something that can really make a difference with all of this?
Look for ways to support the movements to be holding police accountable and shifting our understanding of public safety away from giving massive amounts of money to our police departments. And in LA, the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition is a really good resource for getting involved in action and also just understanding what it means to have so much of our budget going just unquestioned to these places. And yeah, just look for ways to be building safety with our communities that have been most harmed, and take some time to feel how sad it is that people are continuing to be treated like even ways you wouldn't treat an animal. I mean, nobody's going to sit on a dog in the road until it dies. So what can you do to push back against that? Because I don't think it matches your values to live in a country where that's normal.
Thank you. And then I guess just to end on a note of positivity, you talked about the untokening. How can people get involved in that or learn more about that? And are there any other organizations out there doing amazing work that you want to give a shout out to before we go?
So untokening.org, that's untokening.org, is where you can read the principles of mobility justice and learn about a webinar series that has been going during COVID. Lots of stuff about doing Black, Indigenous, people of color centered work in transportation and mobility. And yeah, I think that so I've been trying to scale back on my commitments to doing advisory work. So the Untokening is the project I'm with right now, but I always have a place in my heart for People for Mobility Justice, which is based here in Los Angeles.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Adonia. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, especially during such a strange and difficult time when I'm sure we all feel like kind of doing a lot of nothing. We will post all of the links to the organizations that you mentioned and some of the research that you mentioned in the notes here. And yeah, I really look forward to seeing like what you do next and to reading your amazing history of 1800s Los Angeles. This is going to be a really good one. So thanks you all for joining us. We're going to sign off here. This is Ellie at Microcosm Publishing, and you can find us on the internet at microcosm.pub. All right. Bye. All right.